Walking to work had been a struggle. You had just been in the hospital the day before for life-threatening burns that covered your entire body. But orders were orders, and you had been instructed to come into work anyways. Now, as you stand in the conference room covered in bandages, your bosses interrogate you, demanding to know what had happened at the company's shipyards. You tell them of the blinding light that had disintegrated a woman just feet away from you, of the blast that was strong enough to launch a twig through the air so fast it could pierce a person's bones, of the bustling cityscape that had, in an instant, become a smoldering wasteland populated by charcoal-crusted corpses, and of the singular weapon that had caused it all. You warn the men that if a similar device were to ever cross their path, they must duck behind the closest thing they could find. Your superiors listen intently, until one of them stands up and scolds you for being so brazen as to lie about something like this, and that someone would have to be crazy to believe that a weapon powerful enough to level an entire city even existed. Right as you're about to reply, a familiar white light fills the room. It was already too late. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916, to a rural Japanese family in Nagasaki, Japan. After getting his engineering degree at Waseda University in Tokyo, he went back home to Nagasaki and started working as an oil tank designer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. It was for this job that he was in Hiroshima during the summer of 1945. On the morning of August 6th, he and two of his co-workers, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato, were getting ready to leave the city. After spending about 3 months working in the company's shipyard, the men were looking forward to getting home to their families. That morning, on the way to the train station, Yamaguchi noticed he had forgotten his hanko, a Japanese personal stamp used for signing off on documents, and left his co-workers to go back for it. Then, at 8:15 a.m., as Yamaguchi walked towards the Mitsubishi shipyard, he heard a plane flying over the city, and when he looked up, he watched a B-29 bomber drop 2 parachutes carrying a small object. Suddenly, all he could see was a blazing white light, the lightning of a huge magnesium flare. Yamaguchi recalled the naval air raid training he had from working in the shipyard and immediately dove into the irrigation ditch. But he didn't come out unscathed. Even though he managed to cover his eyes and jam his thumbs into his ears, the shockwave from the blast ruptured his eardrums and seemingly lifted Yamaguchi from the ground, sending him flying into a nearby potato field. When he opened his eyes, it was the picture of hell. Burning paper and smoldering clothing were falling from the sky. The sun had been blotted out by thick clouds of dust, and the blue sky had been replaced with darkness and noise. Debris from ripped-apart buildings was still flying everywhere, and a woman who had been walking beside him before the blast was nowhere to be seen. He was nearly 2 miles away from ground zero. As he checked to see how badly he was hurt, he found that the skin on his left arm had been roasted to a brown-black during the explosion. Yamaguchi speculated he'd been hit by some sort of heat ray, but it didn't make much sense. He was familiar with the barrage of American firebombs that had razed Tokyo. This time, it only took one small bomb to cause so much destruction. Once the shock had passed, he began to make his way through the rubble. Dehydrated by his burns, he managed to make his way to a river's edge for a drink of water. Walking along, he came across some boys with strange hairs on their backs. Except, when he got closer, he realized the hairs were actually shards of heated glass buried in their flesh. He helped them quench their thirst and advised them to remove the glass from their backs, but it was clear that they weren't going to survive for long. Eventually, the boys left Yamaguchi to wander through the fires alone, and with the city nearly leveled, all he could do was search for shelter from all the carnage. He had no way of knowing what had happened to his co-workers that morning, and there was no way for him to call for help. So, with no other options, he picked himself up and continued making his way through the city. Hiroshima had a city area of about 26 square miles, but the built areas that were targeted by the bomb covered only about 7 square miles. The fireball from the bomb had reached a whole 900 feet in diameter and hit temperatures of 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground, annihilating nearly everything that was within a quarter of a mile away from its hypocenter. Its blast wave traveled quickly too, and had been powerful enough to destroy more than 2/3 of the city, even collapsing residential buildings that were more than 5 miles away from ground zero. It was later calculated that of the roughly 255,000 citizens living in Hiroshima, an estimated 69,000 people were injured by the bomb, while nearly 66,000 people died from burns, falling debris, or other reasons during its aftermath. And that doesn't even take into account the people who were later affected by radiation sickness and cancer. The vast devastation in Hiroshima from a single bomb led them to understand that they had been hit by something new. Survivors called this new bomb Pika-don, a name based on the Japanese onomatopoeia for the quick flash and boom observed from the blast. Thankfully, Yamaguchi's co-workers, Iwanaga and Sato, survived as they had been in the work office at the newest Mitsubishi plant, which was 2.3 miles away from the hypocenter. A hill situated near the plant shielded them from the full effects of the blast, but they still felt the strong wave of heat and high winds from the explosion. Iwanaga and Sato managed to only sustain a few cuts and bruises, and even attempted to look for Yamaguchi. But due to the damage around the city, the two couldn't get far. Yamaguchi eventually found his way back to the company shipyard where his co-workers were waiting for help, and the three men were relieved to see they were all safe. They agreed that they needed to collect whatever belongings they had left behind in their company's lodgings, and as they trekked through the remains of the city, they continued to witness the extent of the hellscape around them. From the boat, we could see the city burning, said Yamaguchi. Every branch of the delta was burning. The sky was dark, so you could clearly see these pillars of flame. I thought that all of Hiroshima was finished. As they walked through the city, the men noticed many injured children either running or limping by the roadside. None of them cried. I saw so many of these children. Behind them, big fires burned. Miyuki Bridge, next to our dormitory, was still standing, but all over it were burned people, children as well as adults. Some of them dead, some of them on the verge of death. The men went to their company's boarding house, looking for a place to stay the night, only to find it in ruins. One of the men, Iwanaga, would later report to his managers that all the glass that had been in one side of the house was embedded deeply in spears in the opposite wall. At the very least, the three of them found a tunnel nearby to sleep in. Iwanaga left the tunnel early in the morning, and he watched a young woman carry her dead child on her back as she screamed over the devastation and her loss. He encountered a second woman who initially seemed to have been suffering from shock, until Iwanaga noticed the large slash across her abdomen. The woman later fell to the street as she died, while the other woman continued screaming. All Iwanaga could do was turn and run from the cruel sight. After trying to get some rest, the trio retrieved their bags from what was left of their dormitory and moved westward to Koi Station. They had been told by a soldier about plans of sending a train out of Hiroshima that afternoon, and were determined to make it home. Walking the streets, they passed corpses of people and horses. When they reached a collapsed bridge, the men had no choice but to wade through the river to get to the other side, parting through the bodies of the deceased floating on the water. Despite the debilitating weight of the nightmare they were living through, the thought of their families back home helped Sato, Iwanaga, and Yamaguchi carry on until they made it to the crowded train station where other survivors were also hurrying and pushing to get away from the smoldering chaos of the city. During the journey, a pale man had been sitting across from Sato, and on his lap was what looked like a bowl wrapped in cloth. Sato would later ask what the man had been carefully protecting inside the bowl. He revealed that it was the bones of his deceased wife, and he was going to return her to her parents. Everyone just wanted to get home, and the dead deserved to get home too. Yamaguchi and his companions persevered until they could get treatment and rest when they reached their hometown. Iwanaga and Sato both went to their respective houses, which were on the outskirts of the city. They didn't know if they were going to suffer another bomb like the one they had just experienced, so they both removed glass from their windows and deepened their home's air raid shelters. Yamaguchi, on the other hand, went to the Mitsubishi Company's hospital right away, except instead of finding nurses and hospital staff to tend to his wounds, he found no one. Apparently, an air raid alarm had rung right as he arrived, and the hospital staff had fled to underground shelters. The burns on his body had swelled, and he yelled for help through the stinging pain. Thankfully, in another stroke of luck, one doctor had disobeyed the siren. It turned out to be an old friend of his, who didn't even recognize his face at first due to the excessive swelling of the burns that had covered it. Yamaguchi received burn treatment as the doctors cut away sheets of dead skin from his affected limbs, before sterilizing and applying oils to the wounds. Yamaguchi was covered in bandages, obscuring his face so much so that when he returned home to see his mother, his injuries scared her enough into believing he was a ghost. And then, he went to work. It had been only 3 days since he escaped death in Hiroshima, but he had to comply with orders from the Mitsubishi Company, He had been informed about the company's instructions by the same soldier who helped him and his co-workers find the train out of the city. Their orders? Any surviving engineering personnel must report to the Mitsubishi Company's headquarters in Nagasaki in order to give their accounts of what happened to the city. Orders are orders, he told his wife as he stroked his 2-year-old son's hair before leaving for work. Right away, he told his supervisors of the woman who was walking behind him and how she was obliterated by the blast, of the people close to the flash zone being instantly burned and flayed, and how the blast was strong enough to launch a twig so fast through the air that it could pierce someone's bones. If a similar device should explode here, at the instant you see the flash, you must seek any shelter available, even if all you can do is duck behind a desk or a chair. As he gave his report to his bosses and fellow engineers, one of the section chiefs in the conference room called him a liar. "This is beyond common sense," the section chief interrupted. "The damage to Hiroshima is nothing like this hoax you are trying to weave. How can one bomb turn out such energy to destroy an entire city? You are an engineer. Calculate it." His superior's response had been incredibly unreasonable, given that Yamaguchi experienced the bomb firsthand. But his superior couldn't wrap his head around the fact that it was a new type of bomb, one that could cause buildings to lift into the air or separate one's flesh from their bones. No one in that room had seen what Yamaguchi had seen, but he asserted himself by referring to his bandaged wounds as proof of the new weapon's existence. The section chief still wouldn't relent though, and continued to insist that Yamaguchi was crazy. At least, that was until the office suddenly lit up with a blazing white light, the same blinding light Yamaguchi saw in Hiroshima. A second atomic bomb had dropped, this time right in his hometown of Nagasaki. But what made Yamaguchi so special? Why was he seemingly being followed by futuristic weapons of mass destruction? The reality is, Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't ordinary cities, and neither was the state of the world. Imperial Japan had been a major power in Pacific Asia during the 1930s, launching invasions and colonizing different countries. But they had begun to take more losses after joining World War II, when they bombed the American military base in Pearl Harbor, which consequently also ushered in the United States' entry into the war. This led Japan to experience multiple firebombings, the deadliest of which was in Tokyo, March of 1945, killing an estimated 80,000 to over 100,000 people in a single night. The Japanese government and US forces both knew that Japan needed to surrender soon, as its domestic resources were dwindling and an anti-war sentiment had been brewing among Japanese civilians. The problem was Japan's military units didn't see surrender as an option. Whether it was a nationalistic fervor or the Japanese fighting spirit, simply ordering a surrender wouldn't go down without the possibility of a fierce pushback or, at worst, complete defiance and disregard. The Japanese military had once displayed that very fighting spirit when they launched the Ketsugo, which was essentially a counteroffensive defense plan where even civilians would be expected to take arms, and trained soldiers utilized aircrafts, divers, and attack boats against American attacks at the expense of their own lives. That said, members of the government continued to submit proposals of moving towards peace, going as far as attempting a mediation through the Soviets via a renewal of its neutrality pact with Japan. But the efforts went nowhere. In early June that year, US President Harry S. Truman had been advised to use the atomic bomb as its development program was nearing completion. They had successfully secured Okinawa that month, but it was found that more than 60,000 Allied personnel were killed in action, regardless of Japanese military and civilian deaths reaching up to between 110,000 and 250,000. The Allies took this as a clear sign that Japanese forces would not back down from the fight no matter how much they were losing. That show of resistance was followed by the Potsdam Declaration signed by the Allies in July. The declaration outlined the specific terms of surrender they required from Japan. However, it also concluded with a threat. "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." As you can guess, Japan rejected the terms. And that leads us to Hiroshima, the first site that would show Japan that President Truman meant what he said. There were also layers to the initial atomic bombing because days before Japan sent in its rejection, President Truman had already approved the deployment of the atomic bombs. You see, There had been two main motivations for using the new weapon on Japan aside from pressuring them into surrendering. First, the military wanted to see how effective the atomic bomb was in actual combat. And second, if successful, it would ensure that the US would stand as a major power once the war was over, essentially working as a strong arm against Japan and any other country that would want to go against the US in the future. Surprisingly, though, Truman's claim of responsibility for the first atomic bombing was met with skepticism and nonchalance from the Japanese military. The Imperial Army wouldn't acknowledge that it was an atomic bomb without an investigation. The Imperial Navy, on the other hand, was more inclined to believe that it was an atomic bomb. But they also believed that the process of making an atomic bomb had been too complicated and costly, and that the US had already used their only one. To them, there was no way any other atomic bombs would be dropped, and even if they were wrong about that, they believed that the US military wouldn't have had enough material left over to make a second one that was capable of inducing the same level of devastation experienced in Hiroshima. Objectively speaking, the Navy wasn't completely wrong, but they weren't completely right either. They were right in the fact that there was difficulty in creating the bombs, since making enriched uranium and plutonium was a laborious task. But they didn't know that the US had actually made 3 atomic bombs, and even had enough plutonium left over for a 4th one. The other thing they had gotten wrong was that there wouldn't be a bigger bomb than the 15 kilotons little boy that had dropped on Hiroshima. The atomic bomb for Nagasaki, dubbed the Fat Man, had an explosive force of 21 kilotons, which meant that an amount of devastation even worse than what befell Yamaguchi and his co-workers in Hiroshima was about to be unleashed on them again in Nagasaki. The crazy thing was, the second bomb was actually never supposed to fall on Nagasaki that day. But because of unforeseen circumstances, plans changed at the last possible second. The Manhattan Project's Target Committee, who were in charge of defining the ideal targets for the atomic bomb, had wanted to make sure that the targeted cities were large, urban, populated areas of strategic value. Hiroshima was listed specifically for its major military depot with a large urban industrial area and its geographic location between hills that would increase the blast damage. Another city prioritized on the committee's list, Kokura, had also been selected for its military arsenal and surrounding industrial structures. So, on the morning of August 9, 1945, the plane carrying the Fat Man was well on its way to dropping the second bomb on Kokura. That was until the pilots realized the city had become obscured by a hazy cloud cover, keeping them away from their targeted hit point. Not wanting to waste their remaining fuel, the pilots rerouted their planes towards the city that was only 100 miles away, the city last on the target list, Nagasaki. But when they got there, they were unable to drop the atomic bomb at the precise designated location either, once again due to cloud cover. So, despite the second atomic bomb having a stronger blast yield, much of the blast was confined to the Yurakami Valley, protecting a major part of the city. But make no mistake, even with the protection of Nagasaki's topography, there was still enough explosive range to decimate Nagasaki. The Fat Man largely hit the city's industrial valley, but with the old-fashioned wooden buildings covering a lot of the city, nearly every structure in the blast radius was leveled to the ground. Even though there were less casualties in Nagasaki compared to that in Hiroshima, an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people died from the blast, while another 60,000 people suffered major injuries. Of these injuries, of course, was Yamaguchi. "I thought the mushroom cloud had followed me from Hiroshima," he would later say. The blast had blown off his bandages, and once again, he was exposed to the fires with some of his skin nearly separating from his body. The superior who had previously scolded him yelled for his help, but out of frustration, Yamaguchi left him and made his way out of the building, towards home. But when he got there, he found that part of his house had been blown away from the blast, and he couldn't find his wife and son. Through the rubble, he searched for them, praying to any god who would listen to help him. As he kept digging, he eventually found a small bone, one that was small enough to belong to his son. He was horrified. He knew his wife, Hisako Yamaguchi, to be a cautious woman who would have protected herself and their son, yet the bone was there. The truth, however, was a cruel, twisted joke. After Yamaguchi had left for work, his wife stepped out to buy burn medicines for him and made sure to bring along their son with her. Knowing what her husband had gone through, she of course took care in choosing her route to and from their home. And once she heard the air raid siren blare through the city, she immediately took cover at a Mitsubishi shelter, leaving her and her son mostly unharmed. Once the fires had settled down, Hisako returned to see her damaged home, where her husband was desperately searching through the rubble for her and their son. Upon seeing his wife and child alive, Yamaguchi realized that the bone indeed belonged to an infant. But it wasn't his son's. It belonged to the infant child of their cousin who had come to visit them earlier that morning. Hisako relayed to her husband how she had left earlier than originally planned, but the news of their cousin and her baby's deaths began to sink in. Their neighborhood had been destroyed, and it was likely that they were each other's only remaining family, and despite the despair in the air, they were still grateful to be alive and in each other's arms. But that didn't mean everything was going to be smooth sailing going forward. They still had to survive the aftermath. And after being exposed to 2 atomic blasts, Yamaguchi began to suffer from symptoms of radiation poisoning. He and his family settled into the tunnel-type shelter he'd previously built behind his house for Nagasaki's air raid defense program, where he had laid in bed for days. He suffered from high fevers, hair loss, nausea, and gangrenous infected arms. His wife did her best to take care of him, but as time went on, she began to worry that he would soon succumb to his injuries. At one point, a stranger came across their tunnel. He seemed to be familiar with folk medicine, because after seeing maggots feasting on Yamaguchi's dead skin, he advised Hisako to let them remain. Hisako initially doubted that it was going to help her husband. However, as the pests ate his gangrenous flesh, the blisters on his body stopped discharging blood. Once the maggots had done their job, the stranger applied crushed grape seeds and talcum on the wounds to dry them, and later advised Hisako to attach live leeches around his badly burnt hands to keep his blood circulating and to avoid amputating his fingers. Surprisingly, these methods of treating a patient through maggots and leeches are still not uncommon in modern medicine due to their effectiveness, as well as removing the need of more intrusive means of treatment. Hisako also obeyed the stranger when she was instructed to feed her husband a mixture of persimmon leaves, dried rose hips, and other sources of vitamin C, and to cook and serve him liver from any animal she could find, even if she had to get them from rats. Her husband, like other survivors, needed as much help as they could get. But the remaining medical experts in hospitals in Nagasaki had been overwhelmed by soldiers and other atomic bomb survivors, and because of how scarce medical supplies were, people needed to come up with whatever way they could treat themselves. The Yamaguchis knew this and wanted to repay the stranger for his kindness, but he wouldn't take any kind of payment from the couple. He left the Yamaguchis later on, and Hisako remained forever grateful for his guidance and help with her husband's condition. But the stranger leaving also meant another thing. They were alone again, and they weren't sure if Yamaguchi would fully recover. It was so uncertain, in fact, that when Japan announced its surrender, it made no difference to Yamaguchi. It was August 15th, 1945, and Yamaguchi was still sick in bed and listening to the radio when Emperor Hirohito proclaimed Japan's surrender. "I had no feeling about it," Yamaguchi said. "I was neither sorry nor glad. I was seriously ill with a fever, eating almost nothing, hardly even drinking. I thought that I was about to cross to the other side." Survivors of the atomic bomb were later identified by the Japanese government and dubbed the hibakusha, a Japanese term translating to those who were bombed. Some had to receive multiple skin grafts because their skin couldn't regenerate or heal enough, while others would form keloids over their wounds, which were thick scar tissues that grew over burn wounds and impaired movement. It was speculated that radiation exposure and heat rays had potentially caused issues with the hibakusha's healing process. Aside from skin problems, radiation-induced cancers of the lung, breast, thyroid, stomach, colon, liver, skin, and bladder were common among survivors, which led to the social stigma against the hibakusha and their families. A lot of the stigma had to do with people's lack of understanding of the effects of burns and radiation. There were fears that the hibakusha would transmit genetic illnesses, and so they were at times rejected from work and made to live in atomic slums, which alienated the survivors and increased their own anxieties over radiation. Hibakushas would thus often choose to not disclose that they were survivors. It took some time before the government recognized the need to provide them and their families with medical care and financial assistance. And it wasn't until 1957, 12 years later, that laws were made to provide extra assistance with chronic illnesses brought about by the atomic blasts, securing that the survivors would indeed receive treatment. And so, against all odds, Yamaguchi was among the roughly 200,000 survivors who lived through the atomic bombings and their aftermath, while simultaneously overcoming the agonizing recovery from radiation sickness. Yamaguchi and his wife later had 2 more children and managed to live a long and peaceful life together, even with the issues they faced as hibakusha. Yamaguchi settled to work as a translator for Allied occupation forces once the war was over, and later became a teacher before he went back to working as an engineer for Mitsubishi. He had largely kept his status and memories as a hibakusha to himself, wanting to live a normal life. But by the 2000s, he had a change of heart and started openly opposing the use of nuclear weaponry. He was initially only registered as a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing, admitting having felt some guilt as he knew how hard it was for other survivors to receive help and acceptance in society. He then registered for the bombing in Hiroshima as well, and by 2009, he was officially certified as a Niju hibakusha, twice bombed. Yamaguchi went on to write poetry and songs about the atomic bomb, and participated in a documentary about his experiences, stating, "I can't understand why the world cannot understand the agony of the nuclear bombs." He said, "How can they keep developing these weapons?" His son later died of cancer at the age of 59 in 2005, while Hisako died in 2008 from kidney and liver cancer at the age of 88. Yamaguchi himself had cataracts and acute leukemia later in life, but through his survival, he embodied the reason he believes he was spared. Having experienced atomic bombings twice and survived, it is my destiny to talk about it. He lived out that very destiny as a witness of the atomic bombs, believing that everything followed after his survival experience truly was a blessing. And perhaps it was, as he died at the ripe age of 93, the stomach cancer only catching up to him months before after he testified as a Niju hibakusha. Yamaguchi's voice as an advocate for peace and human dignity will always remain in our collective memory. It's important to remember that peace is always on the table for any conflict, even in the most difficult of times, and the love and respect for human life can always serve as a guide for us to help one another. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one about the man who survived being struck by lightning not just once, but 7 times. Click the video on your screen now to watch.